A lone knight in full body armor sits upon his stallion, halberd in hand, sword upon his hip, waiting for the invading forces to arrive. The ground rumbles as the invading army draws near. Soldiers marching, and their cavalry numerous, but not riding horses, rather riding tanks. So what will this knight do? Will he stand his ground against hundreds who are armed with rifles, machine guns, and tanks? And him, only armed with an axe, a sword, and a trusty steed. Will he stand his ground, or will he turn and run? Join me this episode as we dive into history as a knight decided to stand up against the Nazis. Sometimes imagination goes too far, but sometimes it goes just far enough. Many of us, if not all of us, at one time in our lives as children, picked up sticks, pretending to be heroes, warriors, or knights. We let our minds dream of being in armor and saving the day, and a few of those kids never let the fantasy go. A few, like Josef Mencik. He would dedicate his life to turning that dream into reality. The dream of being an actual knight. Little is known about Josef's early life. He was most likely born around the mid to late 1800s, when, we do not know. He was believed to be the oldest of 4 siblings, but it's up for debate if he even had siblings. We know nothing about his parents, or how he was raised, or where his love of history and knights came from. He was an extremely private man when it came to his own history, talked very little about his past, and would take it all to his grave. What we do know, however, is that he grew up in Böhmerwald region. Böhmerwald just means Bohemian forest, a range of forest that spreads between, at the time, Czechoslovakia, now Czech Republic, Germany, and Austria. Like many places in history, the geography in the region is complicated, and a debated region between the countries. You see, the Böhmerwald region is part of Sudetenland. Sudetenland is just named for areas of Sudeten Germans, German speakers, that found themselves after World War I being part of Czechoslovakia, which makes things complicated and tense between not only governments, but the people themselves. Josef himself lived in a small town called Strakonaca, and his town of Strakonaca was a medieval fortress, a castle from the 14th century. Over the centuries, though, the castle would be unkempt, modified, and neglected. Before Josef, the castle would be used as a granary and a school, and eventually abandoned. The castle even caught fire at one time, making it scarred and almost in complete ruins. The castle was in such bad disarray that it was supposed to be demolished by the owners, the Schwarzenberg family. Josef, knowing the castle was going to be demolished, and knowing the state of the castle, he knew that it would be cheap, and that he could afford to buy a castle. So he made an offer to the family, and bought the castle off them in 1911. Josef would take it upon himself to begin repairing and restoring the castle to its former glory, not adding modern luxuries, but rather try to keep it authentic as possible. A bold choice. That meant no plumbing and no electricity, rather using torches and candles, along with outhouses and chamber pots. And somewhere along the way of repairing the castle, or perhaps beforehand, we do not know, he would meet and marry his wife, Emma Mechanova. Could you imagine convincing your wife to let you buy a burnt-down castle? Or, stranger still, convincing a woman to marry you when you own and repairing a castle so that you can be a knight like in your childhood dreams? That man must have had some charisma. He would spend 30 years repairing the castle, along the way filling the castle with antiquities and artifacts, trying to make the castle fit the high Middle Ages, with some liberties. Apparently, and there's no proof of this, he had a moat which he filled with wooden-carved crocodiles. And the artifacts, well, they were anything he could get his hands on that dealt with the medieval ages. He even got himself a set of armor from France that fitted him. This man loved history and loved to share it with others. He would allow anyone with an interest to tour his home, turning his home into a living museum. Like I said, this guy really loved history. So much so, he was able to convince his wife Emma and their 2 kids to dress up during tours to reenact night tales. He loved history through and through. And it wasn't just the castle where he tried to live as a knight. He would practice chivalry, a code of conduct for knights back in the day, of being respectful, helpful, and courteous. He would take his knightly ways to the outside world and amongst the community. He would call himself the Last Knight, and the townspeople would play into it, calling him the Knight of Sakanose. And by all accounts, though few, the townspeople liked him because he tried to truly live up to chivalry code, helping and respecting everyone. According to a local newspaper at the time called Ronoskodobareski, Josef was a local counselor, an adventurer with a taste of rum and anchovies. Imagine a man pretending to be a knight on your local council. I might attend those meetings, and the rum part is probably underplayed, for apparently he was a regular at the local taverns, where he had a ritual of, and I quote, to swallow a whole herringbone, which then he drank with a good glass of rum, and then shouted, menningsly, end quote. Sounds like a fun drinker. And you know what the odd part is? This wasn't a Don Coyetti scenario. He knew he wasn't really a knight. He would drop the act when serious moments would arise. He just liked being and playing a knight. He knew he wasn't actually a knight. Well, that would be until 1938, when an opportunity would arise, and he would, in my eyes, show the world he was a knight in his heart. In 1938, Hitler started to have his eyes on conquering the world, starting off with Sutenland, to recapture German-speaking lands. He created a force of pro-Nazi Czechs to infiltrate the area, and, at home, convinced the German people to start taking over Czechoslovakia, saying that the Czechs were killing the Sudetenland Germans, and this worked. And in 1938, an armored unit had entered Bremerwald region to begin conquering of Europe. No one had dared stand in the way of the Nazis. To stand up to a well-armed force, to stand up to tanks, was overwhelming for everyone. The Germans met no resistance as they entered Czechoslovakia. Well, except a few. One being Josef. Hearing the news that an armored army of Nazis were on their way, he did what he only knew how to do. Be a knight. Whether it be courage, muscle memory, or insanity, Josef would put on his armor from France. The best way to describe the armor is it looks like medieval armor with a metal Spanish-like conquistador helmet. And you have to remember, at this time in 1938, Josef is old, long in the tooth, and most likely in his 70s. And with his armor on, he looked like the knight guarding the Holy Grail in the end of Indiana Jones and Last Crusade. Pretty close resemblance. With his armor on, he would grab his sword and adorn it on his waist. Grab hold of his halberd, the weapon of choice for knights in the medieval era. Basically a long axe with a pointy spike at the end. He would mount his trusting thoroughbred horse and ride out to meet the Nazis. And there he waited, on horseback, in full armor, as the Nazi forces, armed with rifles, machine guns, and tanks, approached. The Germans see Josef, causing everyone to stop. No one makes a move. The Nazis have no idea what's going on, and for a moment, all is still. All is quiet. An army of Germans, and across the way, an old man in knight armor, sitting upon his horse. Then, the Nazis proceed to advance, I imagine with some caution. Josef, not moving, just staying there, mounted on his trusty steed, doesn't bat an eye. The Germans don't fire. They look at one another and ask themselves, is this guy crazy? They lower their guns and begin to proceed to walk past him. As they do so, German soldiers start to tap their helmets and nod as they walk past him, believing that this 70-ish-year-old man in knight armor is just a crazy old man and poses no threat. Eventually, Josef would have to move to his side as the tanks would roll up on him. The entire German army would pass, only stopping for a small moment. No blood was drawn, no shot was fired, no battle ensued. But for a moment, a lone old man dressed as a knight stopped the advance of the Nazis, if only it was for a moment. And you may think to yourself, why is this so important? He didn't stop them fully. He didn't kill any of them. The importance is, an old man who lived his entire life by a code, outgunned, literally, rode out on horseback to at least attempt to stand up to the Nazis. And you have to remember, this is 1938. This is before Germany invaded Poland. Josef was one of the first, hell, he may have been the first person in another country to stand up to the Nazis as they invaded. The importance is a man saw injustice and chose to stand alone against it. He might not have been a mighty hero and saved the day, but for a brief moment, he made the Nazi troops and tanks stop in their tracks. No pun intended. And that is knightly. He also never had his castle taken or seized during all of World War II, so technically, he successfully defended his castle, so count that as a win. Josef would live to see the end of the war in Europe, and on November 17th, the Czechoslovakian government made his castle his home, a nationalized spot. And 2 days later, on November 19th, 1945, Josef would die in his son's home at the age of somewhere between the late 70s and early 80s. Some may laugh at this man. Some may say he was a crazy person. I say, he was a man who lived his dream. He got to have a loving family, live in a castle, be a knight his entire life, and when the moment arose, as an old man, he put on his armor and rode out to face the Nazis in the attempt to do something, no matter how small it may be. He was a knight, not adored by a king or a queen, not born into a noble family, at least none that we know of. He became a knight of his own accord, and shared his love of medieval history with many. And if that's not knightly, I don't know what is. And with that being said, thank you all for listening.